The October mist had settled over Little Wickham like a grey silk scarf, transforming the familiar village into something altogether more mysterious. Through the tall windows of the parish hall, the world appeared as watercolour smudges, the ancient oak trees mere suggestions of themselves, the stone cottages reduced to gentle impressions against the pearl-coloured sky. It was the sort of weather that made even the most practical person think of ghost stories and half-remembered legends, the kind that sent sensible villagers scurrying indoors with grateful thoughts of warm fires and stronger tea. Mrs. Margaret Thornfield adjusted her spectacles and surveyed the scene before her with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed many such gatherings over her 78 years in Little Wickham. The annual Harvest Festival tea was proceeding with its customary blend of gentle chaos and determined cheerfulness. Long tables draped in spotless white cloths groaned under the weight of Victoria sponges, jam tarts, and those peculiar rock cakes that Mrs. Pemberton insisted on contributing despite universal evidence that her baking skills had not improved since the war. Margaret had earned her place as the village's unofficial observer of human nature through decades of patient listening and careful watching. Her neighbours often remarked that she possessed an almost uncanny ability to understand the hidden currents that flowed beneath Little Wickham's placid surface. What they didn't realize was that human nature, in her experience, followed patterns as predictable as the seasons, if one only knew how to look. This afternoon, her attention was drawn to several interesting undercurrents. There was Mrs. Vivian Ashworth, the village's self-appointed social arbiter, whose usually immaculate composure showed hairline cracks of strain. Her laugh seemed forced, her smile too bright, and she kept glancing toward the entrance as if expecting or dreading someone's arrival. Near the tea urn, young Dr. James Whitmore stood in animated conversation with Miss Catherine Bellwether, the librarian, their heads bent close together in a manner that suggested their discussion involved more than the weather or the quality of Mrs. Hartwell's scones. Most intriguing of all was Mrs. Rosalind Fairfax, who sat alone at a corner table, methodically stirring her tea with the mechanical precision of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere entirely. Rosalind was something of an enigma in Little Wickham, a woman in her early 40s who had arrived 3 years ago following what was diplomatically referred to as difficulties in London. She kept to herself, maintained an immaculate cottage garden, and possessed the sort of quiet elegance that made other women feel simultaneously envious and protective. The afternoon's comfortable routine was interrupted when the temperature dropped noticeably, sending a collective shiver through the assembled villagers. Someone had left the main door ajar, and the autumn mist had begun creeping into the hall like an uninvited guest. Mrs. Pemberton bustled over to close it, muttering about draughts and the impossibility of keeping anything warm in such weather. It was then that Margaret noticed Rosalind Fairfax rise from her table and move toward the large window that faced the village green. The glass had fogged heavily from the contrast between the warm interior and the cool, damp air outside. Rosalind stood before it for a long moment, seemingly lost in thought, her delicate fingers tracing absent patterns in the condensation. Margaret watched with growing interest as Rosalind's finger moved more deliberately across the fogged surface. She was writing something, letters forming with careful precision despite the awkward medium. From her position across the hall, Margaret could just make out the shapes. Martin. The name hung there in the mist like an accusation or a prayer, the letters already beginning to blur at the edges as the warm air worked to reclaim the glass. Rosalind stared at what she had written for perhaps 30 seconds, her face a mask of emotions too complex to decipher from a distance. Then, with a sudden, almost violent gesture, she swept her palm across the window, erasing the name entirely. But Margaret had seen it, and she noticed with the sharp attention that had served her so well over the years, so had Dr. Whitmore, whose conversation with Miss Bellwether had faltered as his gaze fixed on Rosalind's actions. The young doctor's face had gone quite pale, and his teacup rattled against its saucer as he set it down with hands that were no longer entirely steady. The comfortable atmosphere of the harvest tea began to shift in ways that most of the attendees wouldn't consciously notice but would feel as a subtle unease, like the barometric pressure change that precedes a storm. Mrs. Ashworth's forced cheerfulness became even more pronounced. The Reverend Mr. Blackwood, who had been moving through the crowd with his usual genial manner, paused in his circuit to glance repeatedly toward the window where Rosalind still stood. Margaret rose from her chair with the deliberate care of age and made her way to the refreshment table, positioning herself where she could observe the various players in this unfolding drama. In her long experience, she had learned that the most revealing moments often came not from what people said, but from what they didn't say, and from the small, unconscious gestures that betrayed their true thoughts. As she reached for a cucumber sandwich, she heard Mrs. Ashworth's voice rise slightly above the general murmur. Of course, some people never learn to leave the past where it belongs, do they? Always stirring up old troubles, bringing back things that are better left buried. The comment seemed directed at no one in particular, but Margaret noticed that Rosalind's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Dr. Whitmore had abandoned his conversation entirely and was now moving toward the exit with the purposeful stride of someone who had suddenly remembered an urgent appointment. "Dreadful weather for October," observed Miss Bellwether, appearing at Margaret's elbow with the slightly breathless quality of someone seeking refuge in safe conversation. "Makes one quite melancholy, doesn't it? All that mist and gloom." "Indeed," Margaret replied mildly, though her attention remained focused on the subtle tensions playing out around them. "Though I've always found that weather merely reveals what was already there, rather than creating anything new." Miss Bellwether gave her a sharp look, as if suspecting deeper meaning in the comment, but before she could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Mrs. Pemberton had returned from her errand to close the door, but instead of the satisfied expression one might expect from someone who had successfully banished an unwelcome draft, she wore a look of considerable distress. "I'm afraid," she announced to the room at large, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have to share, "there's been an accident. Or perhaps—" She paused, wringing her hands in a manner that suggested the news was worse than a simple mishap. "Mrs. Fairfax, dear, I think you'd better come. It's about your cottage." The effect on Rosalind was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from her face, and she swayed slightly as if the words had struck her a physical blow. "What about my cottage?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Pemberton glanced around the room, clearly uncomfortable with being the bearer of such tidings before an audience. "There's smoke, dear. Quite a lot of it, and the fire brigade is already on their way." In the stunned silence that followed, Margaret found herself studying the faces around her with renewed intensity. Shock, concern, and sympathy were all present in appropriate measures. But there was something else as well. A flicker of something that might have been satisfaction in Mrs. Ashworth's eyes, and a careful blankness in Dr. Whitmore's expression that suggested he was working very hard to reveal nothing at all. As Rosalind gathered her coat and hurried toward the door, followed by a concerned cluster of neighbors, Margaret remained where she was. The name on the fogged window had been erased, but its implications lingered like smoke in the air. In her long experience with the darker aspects of human nature, she had learned that coincidences were rarely as coincidental as they appeared, and that the most innocent gestures could carry the weight of the most terrible secrets. The harvest tea continued around her, but the comfortable rhythms of village life had been disrupted. Something had been set in motion, something that began with a name written in condensation and would, Margaret suspected, end somewhere far, more serious than a cottage fire. She picked up her knitting bag and made her way quietly toward the door. After all, someone should keep an eye on things, and in Little Wickham, that someone had always been Margaret Thornfield. The mist outside seemed thicker now, and in its grey embrace, Margaret could already sense the shadows of secrets beginning to stir. The lane to Rowan Cottage had transformed into an impromptu village gathering point, with residents clustering in small groups despite the persistent drizzle that had begun to fall. The fire brigade had completed their work with admirable efficiency, leaving behind the acrid smell of dampened smoke and the peculiar atmosphere that always follows a crisis, narrowly averted. Margaret positioned herself near the cottage gate, where the low hedge afforded an excellent view of both the damaged building and the various human dramas unfolding around it. Chief Inspector Morrison had arrived from the county seat within the hour, a methodical man whose presence immediately elevated the incident from village gossip to serious investigation. Margaret had encountered him during previous unfortunate events in Little Wickham and had developed a healthy respect for his thorough approach. He emerged from the cottage after a lengthy examination, his expression thoughtful rather than relieved. "Mrs. Thornfield?" He greeted her with a slight nod, recognizing her unofficial but valuable role in village affairs. "I suppose you've observed the usual collection of theories and speculation." "Indeed," Margaret replied, watching as he consulted his notebook, "though I suspect you've discovered something that transforms this from mere accident to deliberate mischief." Morrison's eyebrows rose appreciatively at her directness. "Quite right. Someone used an accelerant in the sitting room. Petrol, most likely. This fire was deliberately set, no question about it." He glanced toward Rosalind, who sat on a garden bench surrounded by concerned neighbors. "The question now is, who would want to destroy Mrs. Fairfax's home, and why?" The news rippled through the assembled villagers with predictable effect. Mrs. Pemberton gasped audibly and immediately began speculating about insurance fraud, while Mrs. Ashworth's expression sharpened with something that might have been vindication. She had been holding forth near the cottage door, her voice carrying clearly across the garden. "I've always said there was something not quite right about the whole situation," Mrs. Ashworth declared to her audience of Mrs. Gable and Miss Bellwether. A woman of her age, arriving alone with no references, keeping herself so private, and now this deliberate fire. Well, it suggests someone has caught up with her past, doesn't it? Dr. Whitmore, who had been tending to Rosalind with what seemed excessive solicitude, looked up sharply at Mrs. Ashworth's words. His medical bag sat unopened beside the bench, suggesting his ministrations had been more emotional than physical. Margaret noted with interest how his hands trembled slightly as he helped Rosalind to her feet. "Mrs. Fairfax needs rest, not speculation," he said firmly, though his voice carried an undertone of something that might have been fear. "This has been a terrible shock for her." Margaret found herself studying the young doctor's demeanor with growing curiosity. His reaction to the name Martin at the harvest tea had been unmistakably significant, and his current agitation seemed disproportionate to mere professional concern. In her experience, such pronounced anxiety often indicated personal involvement rather than simple sympathy. Inspector Morrison approached Rosalind with professional gentleness. "Mrs. Fairfax, I'm afraid I need to ask some difficult questions. Can you think of anyone who might have reason to target your property? Anyone from your past, perhaps, who might harbor ill will?" Rosalind's composure, which had held remarkably well throughout the afternoon's ordeal, finally showed signs of cracking. Her hands twisted in her lap as she glanced nervously between the inspector and the gathered villagers. "There was someone," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Someone in London who made threats when I decided to leave." "And this person's name?" Morrison prompted gently. The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Margaret watched the interplay of emotions across Rosalind's face. Fear, calculation, and what looked suspiciously like resignation. Finally, in a whisper that nonetheless carried clearly in the still air, she spoke. "Martin. His name was Martin." The effect was immediate and telling. Dr. Whitmore's face went pale, Mrs. Ashworth's mouth formed a small O of surprise, and even the Reverend, who had been quietly offering comfort to distressed parishioners, turned sharply at the name. Margaret filed away each reaction carefully. The name that had appeared so briefly on the fogged window was clearly significant to more people than just Rosalind Fairfax. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous secrets were often those shared by multiple parties, each believing themselves to be the only one burdened with the knowledge. As the crowd began to disperse and arrangements were made for Rosalind's temporary accommodation, Margaret remained thoughtful. The fire had been deliberately set, the perpetrator remained unknown, and the name Martin hung in the air like an unresolved chord. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring fresh revelations, but tonight Little Wickham would buzz with speculation and carefully guarded secrets. The mystery was deepening, and Margaret found herself looking forward to unraveling its complexities. The morning sun broke through the lingering wisps of mist, transforming Little Wickham into a village of sharp shadows and golden light. The previous day's drama had settled into the comfortable rhythm of collective speculation, and Margaret found the streets alive with an energy that spoke of secrets shared and theories debated. She made her way toward the village center, where the post office and general store served as the unofficial headquarters for all matters of local significance. Mr. Pierce, the postmaster, greeted her with the solemn air of a man burdened with official knowledge. "Terrible business, Mrs. Thornfield. Quite terrible indeed." He adjusted his spectacles and lowered his voice conspiratorially. "There's been a telegram for Mrs. Fairfax, arrived just after the fire brigade departed yesterday evening, from London, signed only with the initial M and stating arriving 3:40. Today's date, I presume, though no train arrives at that precise time. Most irregular." Margaret absorbed this information with quiet interest. How curious! One wonders if Mrs. Fairfax was expecting this correspondence. "That's just it," Mr. Pierce continued, clearly troubled by the implications. "She seemed quite distressed when I mentioned it this morning. Went pale as winter frost and asked me to hold all further correspondence until she could arrange a forwarding address. Most unusual behavior for someone planning to remain in the village." The morning's revelations continued at the general store, where Mrs. Hartwell dispensed groceries alongside generous portions of village wisdom. The assembled customers had formed their own investigative committee, with Mrs. Pemberton holding court near the preserves section. "Mark my words, there's more to our Mrs. Fairfax than meets the eye," Mrs. Pemberton declared with the authority of someone who had witnessed the initial crisis. "She's been asking peculiar questions since she arrived. About local records, old families, that sort of thing. And yesterday, when I saw the smoke, she wasn't surprised. She was frightened. There's a difference, you know." Mrs. Gable nodded sagely while examining apples with unusual care. "And what about young Dr. Whitmore? Did you notice how he rushed to her side? Seemed to know exactly what she needed before she asked. Makes one wonder about the nature of their acquaintance." Margaret made her purchases quietly, noting how conversations shifted when certain names were mentioned. The mysterious Martin had become the village's primary suspect, but the undercurrents suggested more complex relationships than a simple case of external threat. Her observations were interrupted by the arrival of Miss Bellwether, whose usually composed demeanor showed signs of considerable internal struggle. The librarian approached Margaret with obvious reluctance, her hands trembling slightly as she counted coins for her modest purchase. "Mrs. Thornfield," Miss Bellwether said quietly, "might I have a word? I fear I may possess information relevant to yesterday's incident." They stepped into the morning sunshine, where Miss Bellwether glanced around nervously before speaking in lowered tones. "Several months ago, Mrs. Fairfax requested access to our newspaper archives. London papers, specifically, from the period just before her arrival here. She seemed to be searching for something particular, and when she found it, she became quite distressed." "And the nature of this discovery?" Margaret prompted gently. Miss Bellwether's discomfort increased visibly. "An article about financial irregularities involving someone with a familiar surname." She photocopied the entire piece and studied the accompanying photographs for the longest time. I couldn't help but notice that one of the individuals pictured bore a striking resemblance to someone we know quite well in Little Wickham. Margaret filed this intriguing detail away for future consideration. The web of connections was becoming increasingly complex, with threads leading in directions that challenged the simple narrative of an external threat. Their conversation was interrupted by the sight of Dr. Whitmore's surgery, its windows uncharacteristically shuttered despite the morning hour. A hastily written sign announced emergency appointments only, most unusual for the typically punctual physician. As Margaret completed her circuit of the village, she found herself assembling the morning's revelations into a more troubling pattern. The telegram suggesting an imminent arrival, Miss Bellwether's discovery of newspaper research involving familiar surnames, and Dr. Whitmore's obvious distress all pointed toward complications far more intricate than a straightforward case of arson by a disgruntled London associate. The name Martin had been written with deliberate care on that fogged window, then erased with equal determination. Now it seemed that Martin might be arriving in person, and the village's carefully maintained equilibrium was about to face its most serious test. Margaret settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, prepared to observe the afternoon's developments with particular attention. The afternoon brought the anticipated arrival, though not quite in the manner Little Wickham had expected. At precisely 4 o'clock, a modest motor taxi drew up before the Green Man Inn, discharging a gentleman whose appearance immediately commanded the attention of those villagers who happened to be conducting business in the vicinity. He was a man of perhaps 45, neatly dressed in a manner that suggested modest prosperity rather than wealth, with the sort of careful bearing that comes from years of maintaining appearances despite uncertain circumstances. Margaret observed his arrival from her strategic position near the post office, noting how Mr. Pierce's face appeared at the window with undisguised curiosity. The newcomer paid his fare with deliberate precision, collected a single well-worn leather valise, and surveyed the village, square with the calculating gaze of someone assessing both opportunities and obstacles. Within minutes, Inspector Morrison had been summoned from the parish hall, and the two men disappeared into the inn's private dining room. The subsequent hour passed with the peculiar tension that accompanies significant events unfolding just beyond public observation. Margaret noted how Dr. Whitmore's surgery remained shuttered despite the afternoon appointment hour, and how Mrs. Ashworth found repeated reasons to pass by the inn's windows, each time with an expression of increasing frustration at the opaque glass. When Inspector Morrison finally emerged, his demeanor carried the satisfaction of a man whose theories had been confirmed. He gathered the principal interested parties, Mrs. Ashworth, the Reverend, and Margaret herself, in the inn's public room for what he clearly considered a conclusive briefing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, consulting his notebook with official precision, "I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Martin Thorne, Mrs. Fairfax's cousin, who has travelled from London to address certain family matters that have been causing considerable distress." Martin Thorne rose from his chair with quiet dignity, though Margaret detected a wariness in his manner that suggested familiarity with hostile audiences. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured tones of someone accustomed to explaining himself under difficult circumstances. "I regret that my arrival has coincided with such unfortunate events," he said, addressing the group with careful courtesy. "I sent the telegram to inform Rosalind of my intention to visit, hoping we might resolve certain disagreements regarding our late uncle's estate. I had no knowledge of the fire until Inspector Morrison informed me." Mrs. Ashworth leaned forward with barely concealed eagerness. "And these disagreements, they involved substantial sums, I presume?" Martin's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Rosalind inherited property that the family believed should have been distributed more equitably. There have been tensions regarding her decision to sell without consultation. However, I must emphasize that our disputes, while heated, never involved threats of violence. Inspector Morrison nodded approvingly. Mr. Thorne has provided documentation of his journey from London, including his train ticket, which places him en route during the time the fire was set. However, the timing of his arrival, combined with the family tensions, certainly provides a clear motive for someone acting on his behalf. Margaret found herself studying Martin Thorne's reactions with particular interest. His surprise at learning of the fire appeared genuine, as did his obvious discomfort with being positioned as the primary suspect. However, she noted how his gaze repeatedly drifted toward the inn's entrance, as if he expected or feared another arrival. The afternoon's revelations were interrupted by Dr. Whitmore's belated appearance, his usual professional composure replaced by something approaching desperation. His entrance was so poorly timed that Margaret wondered whether it had been deliberately delayed until after Martin's initial questioning. "Inspector Morrison," Dr. Whitmore said, his voice carrying an undertone of barely controlled anxiety, "I believe there are medical considerations regarding Mrs. Fairfax that may be relevant to your investigation." The exchange of glances between Dr. Whitmore and Martin Thorne did not escape Margaret's notice. There was recognition there, though whether from previous acquaintance or merely mutual wariness remained unclear. Martin's expression shifted subtly, suggesting that the doctor's presence introduced complications he had not anticipated. As the official questioning concluded and arrangements were made for Martin to remain available for further inquiries, Margaret found herself increasingly skeptical of the neat resolution that seemed to satisfy both Inspector Morrison and the assembled villagers. The obvious suspect had indeed emerged, complete with clear motive and suspicious timing, yet something in the undercurrents of behavior suggested that the true complexity of the situation remained hidden. Dr. Whitmore's continued agitation, the careful way Martin measured his words, and the lingering mystery of who had actually set the fire all pointed toward deeper complications than a simple case of family inheritance disputes. Margaret gathered her knitting bag with the quiet satisfaction of someone who recognized that the most interesting chapters of this particular mystery had yet to unfold. The village might be ready to accept the obvious explanation, but human nature, in her considerable experience, rarely proved quite so straightforward. The morning mist clung to Little Wickham like a persistent secret, and Margaret found herself drawn to the vicarage where Rosalind had taken temporary refuge. Mrs. Blackwood's sitting room offered warmth and the particular comfort that comes from polished wood and well-tended fires. Rosalind sat wrapped in a borrowed shawl, her composure intact but fragile, like porcelain that had survived one too many moves. "You're very kind to visit," Rosalind said, though her eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned to expect complications rather than comfort. "I keep thinking I should feel more grateful to be alive, but mostly I feel exposed." Margaret settled into the chair that afforded her the best view of both Rosalind's expressions and the garden path beyond the window. "Exposure often precedes understanding," she observed gently. "Yesterday, you wrote a name with great deliberation, then erased it with equal care. Such actions suggest internal conflict rather than mere nervousness." A flush crept across Rosalind's cheeks. "Martin represents difficulties I had. Hoped to leave in London. Family disputes have a way of following one, don't they?" "Indeed they do," Margaret agreed. "Though I suspect family disputes rarely travel alone. Tell me about Dr. Whitmore." The change in Rosalind's demeanor was immediate and telling. Her hands stilled on the teacup, and something that might have been panic flickered across her features before she regained control. "James has been exceptionally kind since my arrival, a true friend during a difficult transition." "Friends often share histories," Margaret suggested. "London connections, perhaps?" Before Rosalind could respond, their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Pemberton's arrival, clutching something small and glinting in her gloved palm. Her excitement was barely contained as she displayed a gentleman's cufflink, gold-plated with the monogram J.W. engraved in elaborate script. "Found it near the churchyard path," Mrs. Pemberton announced triumphantly. Not 50 yards from the route to Rowan Cottage, the catch is damaged, as if it was torn away rather than simply dropped. Margaret examined the cufflink with careful attention, noting both its quality and the fresh nature of the damage. The piece showed no weather wear, suggesting recent loss, and the broken clasp mechanism told its own story of hasty departure or struggle. Within the hour, Inspector Morrison had arrived to collect the evidence and question Dr. Whitmore, whose surgery remained conspicuously closed despite the morning appointment hour. Margaret positioned herself strategically near the post office, where she could observe the doctor's eventual emergence from his consultation with the inspector. When Dr. Whitmore finally appeared, his usual professional bearing had been replaced by something approaching desperation. His explanation to the gathered villagers was both immediate and unconvincing. Evening walks for contemplation, the cufflink lost during routine medical reflection. Yet his hands trembled as he spoke, and his eyes avoided direct contact with anyone present. Most revealing was his reaction when Mrs. Ashworth mentioned Rosalind's name. The careful professional distance he had maintained dissolved entirely, replaced by an intimacy that spoke of shared history and current anxiety. When he addressed Rosalind directly, the slip was subtle but unmistakable. "Ros," he began, then caught himself with visible effort. Margaret filed away this revelation with quiet satisfaction. The diminutive suggested familiarity that extended far beyond recent village acquaintance. Combined with his immediate availability during the fire, his excessive concern for Rosalind's welfare, and now the physical evidence placing him near the cottage, a pattern was emerging that challenged the simple narrative of family inheritance disputes. As the morning's revelations settled into the village's collective consciousness, Margaret found herself reconsidering the entire sequence of events. The convenient timing of Martin Thorne's arrival, the strategic placement of evidence, and the careful orchestration of discoveries all suggested a more sophisticated game than mere arson motivated by financial disagreements. Someone was guiding the investigation toward predetermined conclusions, presenting obvious suspects with suspicious regularity. The true architect of recent events possessed considerable skill in manipulation, understanding exactly how village gossip and official investigation would respond to carefully planted clues. Margaret gathered her knitting bag and made her way home through streets that buzzed with speculation about Dr. Whitmore's involvement. The physical evidence was damning, the behavioral patterns suspicious, yet something in the neat progression of revelations troubled her experienced understanding of human nature. In her long observation of Little Wickham's residents, she had learned that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden behind the most obvious distractions. The cufflink, like the name on the fogged window, might be precisely what someone wanted them to find. The mystery was deepening in ways that suggested the most perilous player had yet to reveal their hand. The morning brought Margaret to Rowan Cottage with Inspector Morrison's permission, where the acrid smell of dampened smoke had settled into every surface like an unwelcome guest. The sitting room told a story that went beyond simple arson, if one possessed the patience to read the subtle signs left behind by hasty actions and careful planning. Margaret paused before the mantelpiece, where soot had painted the plaster a uniform grey, except for one telling detail. A clean rectangle, no wider than a hand, where something had recently stood. The outline was too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be coincidence. Someone had removed a photograph before setting the fire, suggesting that destruction had been selective rather than comprehensive. Near the window, she discovered additional evidence of the intruder's presence. The latch bore a fresh nick in the paint, the sort made by a hurried instrument rather than daily use. More intriguing still was a faint smear of clear polish on the sill, barely visible against the soot, but carrying the distinctive scent she associated with Mrs. Ashworth's drawing room. In Little Wickham, such details might mean nothing, as half the village ladies used the same brand their mothers had favored. Yet combined with other evidence, patterns began to emerge. Her investigation was interrupted by Miss Bellwether's arrival, clutching an archival folder with obvious agitation. In the library's reading room, they spread photocopied newspaper articles between them like pieces of a complex puzzle. The London paper, 6 months old, bore the headline, "Charitable Relief Fund Irregularities, Local Investors Imperiled." Rosalind studied this article for the longest time, Miss Bellwether explained, her voice tight with nervous energy. She seemed particularly interested in the names listed among the trustees, Arthur Ashworth, now deceased, and James C. Whitmore, serving in an advisory capacity. Margaret absorbed this information with growing interest. "The uncle to our Dr. Whitmore, I presume?" "Precisely. When I mentioned that our doctor was of the younger generation and therefore blameless, Rosalind said something rather chilling. One is rarely blameless simply by being younger." Miss Bellwether paused, then continued with obvious reluctance. "But there's more." Rosalind didn't limit her research to London papers. She spent considerable time examining local property records, particularly the ownership history of Rowan Cottage itself and several other village properties. The revelation that Rosalind had been researching local history added an entirely new dimension to the mystery. Margaret found herself reconsidering the entire narrative of external threats and London-based disputes. What specifically drew her attention to these local records? Miss Bellwether consulted her notes with scholarly precision. She traced the ownership of Rowan Cottage through several generations of the Fairfax family until its sale 3 years ago, to herself. But she also examined the history of the old mill house and other properties built around the turn of the century. The mill house records were particularly complex, involving legal disputes and sudden ownership changes. Margaret filed away this information with the growing conviction that Little Wickham's secrets ran deeper than anyone had suspected. Her subsequent visit to the post office provided another piece of the puzzle when Mr. Pierce, eager to demonstrate his observational skills, produced the telegram envelope once more. "No train arrives at 3:40, as I've mentioned," he repeated with satisfaction. "But there is a bus from Market Chaltham that arrives at precisely 19 minutes to 4. Country people keep bus time. City folk speak of trains. The distinction suggests local knowledge rather than London unfamiliarity." At the vicarage, Margaret found Rosalind walking in the garden with Mrs. Blackwood, her composure restored but fragile. When questioned about photographs kept at the cottage, Rosalind's reaction was immediate and telling. A flicker of recognition too quick for most eyes, followed by careful deflection. "I kept very little," Rosalind said with studied casualness, "a habit I acquired upon leaving London." Margaret pressed gently. "Even so, mantles have a way of collecting the past." The subtle probe struck home. Rosalind's hand gripped her shawl, knuckles whitening for an instant before she regained control. More revealing still was her response to questions about her connection to Little Wickham. "My mother grew up here, briefly, before she moved to London," Rosalind admitted, then quickly attempted to redirect the conversation. "We used to visit as children." This revelation transformed Margaret's understanding of the entire situation. Rosalind's arrival in Little Wickham had not been the random flight of someone escaping London troubles, but a deliberate return to family roots. The research into local property records suddenly made perfect sense. She had been investigating her own heritage, perhaps searching for connections that others might prefer to keep buried. The afternoon brought additional evidence when Margaret encountered Dr. Whitmore emerging from another consultation with Inspector Morrison. His explanation about evening walks and lost cufflinks carried the hollow ring of desperation, but more telling was his unconscious slip when addressing Rosalind directly. "Ros," he began, before catching himself with visible effort. The diminutive revealed familiarity that extended far beyond recent village acquaintance. Yet Margaret found herself increasingly skeptical of the neat evidence package being presented. The cufflink, she realized, represented the sort of formal wear inappropriate for Dr. Whitmore's typical evening constitutionals. His usual attire favored practical shirt sleeves, not French cuffs suitable for city dinners and formal occasions. As evening settled over Little Wickham, Margaret found herself assembling the day's revelations into a more complex pattern than anyone had yet suspected. The fire had been designed to destroy specific evidence, most likely the photograph removed from the mantelpiece. The cufflink had been deliberately planted to implicate Dr. Whitmore. Most significantly, Rosalind's deep family connections to the village suggested that the true source of danger lay not in London's financial scandals, but in Little Wickham's own carefully guarded secrets. Someone possessed intimate knowledge of all the players involved, their relationships, their vulnerabilities, and their shared history. Someone had anticipated their protective strategies and turned those very precautions into evidence against them. The most dangerous enemy was operating from within their own circle, manipulating events with the precision that came from years of patient observation and careful planning. Margaret gathered her knitting bag with the quiet satisfaction of someone who recognized that human nature revealed itself not in dramatic gestures, but in small, careless details. The space left behind when a photograph is removed, the wrong type of cufflink for the accused's habits, the faint scent of familiar polish on a windowsill. These were the clues that mattered. The mystery was revealing itself to be less about external threats and more about internal betrayals, with the most perilous secrets rooted deep in Little Wickham's own soil. The evening brought Little Wickham's second fire in as many days, though this blaze carried a precision that transformed coincidence into deliberate pattern. Margaret arrived at the library as Miss Bellwether stood among the dampened ashes of what had been the historical records section, her face pale with the realization that destruction had been surgical rather than random. Only the property ledgers from 1901 to 1910, Miss Bellwether reported, her voice tight with professional outrage. Someone forced the casement window, used paraffin-soaked rags, and burned precisely the pages I had marked for Rosalind's research. Nothing else was touched. Inspector Morrison examined the scene with growing frustration. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was systematically eliminating evidence, staying one step ahead of both official investigation and Margaret's quiet inquiries. More troubling still was the discovery of a partially burned note tucked beneath the reading table, its message clear despite the charred edges. "Stop digging, Ros. Some graves should stay covered." The intimate diminutive struck Margaret as significant. Few people in Little Wickham would dare such familiarity with the reserved Mrs. Fairfax. Yet the handwriting bore the careful formation of someone educated in proper penmanship, the sort taught in village schools decades past. Her subsequent investigation revealed additional evidence that transformed her understanding entirely. In the parish records that predated the destroyed ledgers, she discovered the tragedy that connected past to present with chilling clarity. 50 years ago, a young woman named Eliza Finch had died in a suspicious fire at the old mill house, then owned by the Whitmore family. The official verdict was accidental death, but contemporary newspaper accounts mentioned whispers of foul play and a child witness whose testimony was dismissed as fantasy. That child witness had been Arthur Ashworth, Mrs. Vivian Ashworth's late husband. Eliza Finch, Margaret realized with growing comprehension, had been Rosalind Fairfax's grandmother. The revelation transformed every element of the current crisis. Rosalind's arrival in Little Wickham had not been flight from London troubles, but a carefully planned return to investigate her grandmother's death. Her research into property records, her interest in the mill house, her deliberate writing of Martin on the fogged window, all represented pieces of a strategy years in the making. At the vicarage, Margaret found Rosalind in the garden, her composure intact but fragile. When questioned about her family connections, Rosalind's responses carried the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed explanations for inevitable inquiries. "My grandmother died when my mother was an infant," Rosalind admitted quietly. Mother was raised by her father's family in London, away from Little Wickham and its memories, but she never forgot the questions that were never properly answered. Margaret noted how Rosalind's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, betraying emotions held carefully in check. "And you came here to find those answers." "I came here to find the truth," Rosalind corrected, her voice carrying steel beneath its softness. 50 years of wondering whether my grandmother died accidentally or was murdered. 50 years of a family living with shadows and suspicions. The afternoon brought additional revelations when Dr. Whitmore, released from questioning due to insufficient evidence, appeared at Margaret's cottage with obvious desperation. His usual professional composure had cracked entirely, replaced by something approaching panic. "Mrs. Thornfield," he began without preamble, "Rosalind is in terrible danger. Someone is using her investigation to settle old scores, manipulating her grief for their own purposes." Margaret studied his face with careful attention. "And you know this how, Doctor?" His hesitation spoke volumes. "My grandfather was the constable who investigated Eliza Finch's death. He left papers, private notes about the case. There were things he couldn't prove, people he couldn't accuse without evidence. But he believed Arthur Ashworth's testimony about seeing someone leave the mill house before the fire." "Someone he recognized?" Dr. Whitmore's expression grew haunted. "Someone whose family still lives in Little Wickham. Someone who has spent 50 years believing their secret was safe, until Rosalind arrived, asking questions." As evening settled over the village, Margaret found herself assembling the day's revelations into a pattern more complex than anyone had yet recognized. The fires, the planted evidence, the careful manipulation of suspicion all pointed toward someone with intimate knowledge of both the historical tragedy and the current players. Most significantly, the threatening note suggested that the true perpetrator was growing desperate as Rosalind's investigation approached dangerous territory. The systematic destruction of evidence indicated someone willing to commit increasingly serious crimes to protect a secret that had festered for 5 decades. Margaret gathered her knitting with the quiet certainty that Little Wickham's most carefully guarded secret was about to be exposed and that the most dangerous confrontation lay just ahead. The morning brought a raw wind that worried the hedges and sent smoke sidling down chimneys, the sort of weather that pulled people inward and sharpened the edges of their fears. Margaret woke to news that ran faster than the milk cart through Little Wickham's narrow lanes. Someone had broken into Dr. Whitmore's surgery during the night. The damage was surgical in its precision. The lock on the side door hung twisted, drawers had been upended with perfunctory violence, but only one item truly mattered to the intruder. The tin deed box that James kept beneath the examination couch, containing his grandfather's private notes on the old mill fire, was gone. On the inside pane of the surgery window, hazed by breath and morning damp, a single word was written in the condensation: "Martin." Margaret stood beside Inspector Morrison, studying the scrawled letters with careful attention. She remembered Rosalind's delicate hand from the parish hall, the looping curves, the precise crossbars. This writing was different. Harsh, angular strokes that spoke of deliberate deception rather than unconscious habit. Someone wanted them to believe Martin Thorne had returned for a second act of destruction. "Mr. Calder discovered the break-in during his morning deliveries," Morrison reported, consulting his notebook. "Found the surgery lamp still burning and the door ajar. Whoever did this wanted to be discovered quickly." By 9 o'clock, a second incident pushed the village from unease toward genuine alarm. Mrs. Blackwood, sweeping ashes from the vicarage hearth, heard the sharp clatter of breaking glass. A stone wrapped in brown paper had been hurled through the morning room window, its message brief but chilling: "Leave before evensong or join your grandmother." The threat was no longer subtle, and Margaret noted how Rosalind received the news with surprising composure. Fear had crystallized into determination, replacing uncertainty with steely resolve. "Someone is growing desperate," Rosalind observed quietly. And desperate people make mistakes. Margaret found herself drawn to examine the stone itself, noting the particular type of limestone common to the old mill foundations. More telling still were the bicycle tracks and the damp earth beside the vicarage gate. Narrow wheels, recently oiled, with a distinctive wear pattern on the rear tire that spoke of regular use rather than occasional recreation. At the Green Man, Martin Thorne's alibi grew stronger with each hour. The innkeeper reported that his guest had indeed gone out before dawn for air. Returning with mud on his cuffs and a nicked knuckle, he explained as an encounter with a stubborn gate latch. Yet when Inspector Morrison examined the guest room, he found the leather valise on its stand, one strap freshly mended with bootmaker's thread that matched a charred fragment recovered from the library fire. Margaret observed Martin's growing frustration with quiet interest. His protests of innocence carried the ring of truth, yet the evidence continued to accumulate around him with suspicious convenience. When Morrison questioned him about local transportation, Martin's response revealed knowledge that contradicted his presentation as a London visitor unfamiliar with country ways. "The trains are abominable," he complained, then added without thinking, "The bus from Market Chaltham is more reliable. Arrives at 19 minutes to 4, regular as clockwork." The precision was telling. Country people kept bus time, city folks spoke in railway schedules. Margaret filed away this detail alongside her, growing conviction that someone with intimate local knowledge was orchestrating events with careful attention to both evidence and alibis. Her afternoon visit to Mrs. Ashworth proved most illuminating. The lady received her with unusual briskness, her drawing room gleaming and her manner carrying the forced brightness of someone fighting internal battles. When Margaret admired a porcelain shepherdess on the mantelpiece, Mrs. Ashworth's gloved hand brushed the figurine with curious care, revealing a faint brown blister along her thumb. "An unfortunate encounter with the tea kettle," Mrs. Ashworth explained, a half-second too quickly. Margaret mentioned Eliza Finch's name with studied casualness, watching as a ripple crossed that composed face. Disgust first, then pity swiftly controlled into propriety. "One remembers what becomes of girls who forget their place," Mrs. Ashworth said with careful precision. "Such tragedies breed more tragedy if you let them." The comment carried decades of suppressed knowledge, and Margaret recognized the particular burden of someone who had carried dangerous secrets for far too long. Mrs. Ashworth's hostility toward Rosalind, her immediate suspicions about the newcomer's motives, her careful orchestration of village opinion, all suggested someone protecting more than mere social standing. Miss Bellwether's arrival at Margaret's cottage brought additional pieces to the puzzle. From her bag, she produced a rescued photograph, a village fete from 50 years past, showing bunting, cake tables, and the mill house visible in the background. Among the faces, Margaret recognized a young Arthur Ashworth standing beside Geoffrey Whitmore, and there, carrying lemonade with a backward glance over her shoulder, was unmistakably Eliza Finch. "The angle of that glance," Miss Bellwether observed with scholarly precision, "suggests she was aware of being watched, perhaps even followed." Before Margaret could respond fully, the Reverend arrived with his own troubling news. "I have mislaid a set of keys," he admitted reluctantly. "The vestry cabinet where the mill deeds are kept was found unlocked last week. I thought I had been careless, but now—" Margaret thanked them both and sat quietly after their departure, feeling the noose of chronology tighten around little Wickham's carefully guarded secrets. The pattern was becoming clear. Not coincidence, but choreography, with someone beating time from the wings, manipulating evidence and alibis with the precision that came from years of patient observation. As evening approached, Margaret gathered her knitting with the quiet certainty that the psychological game was reaching its climax. The true architect of recent events was growing desperate, their carefully constructed deceptions beginning to unravel under the pressure of Rosalind's persistent investigation and her own quiet observations. The most dangerous confrontation still lay ahead, and Margaret suspected that before another dawn broke over Little Wickham, 50 years of buried secrets would finally demand their reckoning. The evening brought Margaret to Ashworth House with deliberate purpose, her knitting bag concealing more than wool and needles. The elegant Georgian facade gleamed in the lamplight, its windows casting warm rectangles across the garden path, where bicycle tracks still pressed faint impressions into the damp earth. She had observed those particular tire marks before. Narrow wheels with a distinctive notch in the rear tread that left its signature wherever Mrs. Ashworth conducted her carefully orchestrated village rounds. Vivian Ashworth received her in the front drawing-room, where every surface reflected the obsessive care of someone who understood that perfection could serve as both shield and weapon. The lemon-scented polish hung heavy in the air, its particular fragrance identical to the traces Margaret had detected on the windowsill at Rowan Cottage. "How thoughtful of you to call," Mrs. Ashworth said, her smile carrying the brittle quality of porcelain under stress. "Though I fear the village has exhausted its capacity for sympathy. One must maintain standards, or everything simply deteriorates." Margaret settled into the offered chair, noting how her hostess's gloved hands moved with unconscious care to avoid pressure on the right thumb. The brown blister was barely visible beneath the kid leather, but its presence spoke volumes about recent encounters with volatile substances. "Standards are indeed precious," Margaret agreed mildly, "though I've always found that the most dangerous decay occurs in what we choose not to see. Hidden rot, spreading beneath polished surfaces." The tremor that crossed Mrs. Ashworth's features was subtle but unmistakable. She busied herself with the tea service, her movements precise yet somehow desperate, like someone performing familiar rituals to ward off approaching chaos. Margaret withdrew a photograph from her knitting bag, the village fete image Miss Bellwether had preserved, showing Eliza Finch carrying lemonade with that telling backward glance. "I've been reflecting on old memories," she said conversationally. "How certain moments capture more than their participants realized at the time." Mrs. Ashworth's cup rattled against its saucer as she recognized the image. "Photographs can be misleading," she said carefully. "Angles and shadows create impressions that have little to do with reality." "Quite true," Margaret nodded, "though sometimes they preserve essential truths that witnesses might prefer to forget. Young Arthur saw someone that night at the mill house, didn't he? Not leaving the scene, but arriving. Someone who knew exactly what they would find inside." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with 50 years of carefully suppressed truth. Mrs. Ashworth's composure held, but Margaret could see the hairline cracks beginning to spread across that perfect facade. "Arthur was a fanciful child," Mrs. Ashworth said finally. "Prone to imagination and confusion." Margaret produced the threatening note from her bag, its harsh, angular script a stark contrast to the elegant penmanship she knew Mrs. Ashworth possessed. "Someone has been working very hard to confuse matters recently. The same someone who knows that Roz was what Eliza's granddaughter was called during those childhood visits to Little Wickham. Such intimate knowledge suggests memories stretching back decades." Mrs. Ashworth's breathing had become shallow, her perfect posture wavering as the psychological pressure mounted. Margaret continued with relentless gentleness, each word chosen to probe deeper into wounds that had never properly healed. "The charitable relief fund irregularities that Rosalind discovered, they involved your late husband's family, didn't they? And Eliza Finch found evidence that threatened to expose more than financial impropriety. She found proof of something that would have destroyed reputations, perhaps even sent people to prison." "You're speaking of matters you couldn't possibly understand," Mrs. Ashworth whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "I understand desperation," Margaret replied quietly. "The desperation that drives someone to set fires 50 years apart. The desperation that leads to planting evidence, stealing records, threatening innocent people. The desperation of someone who has lived half a century knowing they committed murder and got away with it." The word hung in the air like an accusation waiting for judgment. Mrs. Ashworth's gloved hands trembled as she reached for her teacup, and Margaret noticed how she automatically avoided putting pressure on that telltale blister, the mark left by handling paraffin-soaked rags in the library fire. Eliza Finch didn't die accidentally, Margaret continued. She was killed because she had discovered evidence that would have ruined the families involved in the relief fund scandal. And when her granddaughter returned to uncover the truth, you realized that 50 years of careful silence was about to be shattered. Mrs. Ashworth's composure finally cracked entirely. She set down her cup with shaking hands, the perfect mask of social propriety sliding away to reveal something far more dangerous underneath. She should have left well enough alone, Mrs. Ashworth said, her voice carrying decades of suppressed fury. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Some people deserve what happens to them when they dig too deep. Margaret gathered her knitting bag with quiet satisfaction. The confession was implicit, but clear, and she could see in Mrs. Ashworth's eyes the recognition that the game was finally over. Tomorrow would bring official accusations and formal charges, but tonight the psychological battle had been won. As Margaret made her way to the door, she paused to glance back at the woman who had orchestrated so much suffering to protect her carefully constructed life. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, she observed gently, no matter how deeply we try to bury it. Outside, the evening mist was lifting, and Margaret could see the first stars beginning to appear through the clearing sky. Little Wickham's longest-held secret was about to be exposed, and she found herself looking forward to the village's return to honest peace. The morning brought Inspector Morrison to the parish hall with the quiet determination of a man whose investigation had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Margaret arrived shortly after, her knitting bag containing more than wool. Within its depths lay the photograph Miss Bellwether had rescued and several other small items that would prove decisive in unraveling 50 years of carefully maintained deception. The gathering storm. The assembled villagers filled the familiar space with an atmosphere quite different from the previous week's harvest tea. Rosalind sat wrapped in Mrs. Blackwood's shawl, her composure intact but fragile, while Martin Thorne occupied a chair near the window with the resigned air of someone who had accepted his role as the obvious suspect. Dr. Whitmore stood near the door, his medical bag clutched like a talisman against the accusations that had threatened to destroy his reputation. Mrs. Ashworth arrived last, as was her custom, choosing a seat that afforded her a clear view of all participants, while positioning herself near the tall windows where morning light could illuminate her carefully maintained facade. Margaret noted how she had selected gloves that completely covered her hands, hiding the telltale blister that had betrayed her involvement in the library fire. Inspector Morrison cleared his throat with official authority. Ladies and gentlemen, after extensive investigation, we have uncovered the truth behind recent events in Little Wickham. However, I believe Mrs. Thornfield's observations will prove most illuminating in explaining how we reached our conclusions. Margaret's gentle revelation. Margaret rose from her chair with the deliberate care of age, her knitting needles quiet in her lap as she addressed the assembled group with the mild tone that had served her so well in previous investigations. When condensation forms on glass, she began conversationally, it provides a temporary canvas for our thoughts and fears. Yesterday we witnessed a name written with careful deliberation, then erased with equal purpose. This morning, another name appeared in a different location, written with harsh strokes designed to deceive, rather than reveal. She withdrew the rescued photograph from her bag, its sepia tones capturing a village fete from half a century past. Miss Bellwether preserved this image, which shows us Eliza Finch on the day before her death. Note the backward glance over her shoulder, the expression of someone who knew she was being watched, perhaps even followed. Mrs. Ashworth's breathing had become noticeably shallow, though her expression remained carefully composed. Margaret continued with relentless gentleness, each observation building toward an inescapable conclusion. The evidence has been quite systematic in its presentation. A cufflink bearing Dr. Whitmore's initials discovered precisely where suspicion would naturally fall upon him. Yet the piece itself tells a different story. Formal wear, inappropriate for evening medical walks, bearing the patina of age that suggests decades in storage rather than recent use. Dr. Whitmore's face showed visible relief as Margaret's analysis cleared him of suspicion, while Inspector Morrison nodded approvingly at her methodical approach. The bicycle tracks near various crime scenes display a distinctive wear pattern, narrow wheels with a characteristic notch in the rear tread. Such marks are as individual as fingerprints to those who know how to read them. Combined with the particular scent of lemon polish detected at Rowan Cottage, they point to someone whose village rounds are conducted with meticulous precision. The psychological trap. Margaret's gaze settled on Mrs. Ashworth with the gentle persistence of someone who understood that truth, once cornered, must eventually surrender to inevitability. The most telling evidence, however, lies in knowledge itself. The precise timing of the Market Chaltham bus, 19 minutes to 4, is information possessed only by those who live by local schedules. When Mr. Thorne mentioned this detail, he revealed familiarity that contradicted his presentation as a London visitor, unfamiliar with country ways. Martin Thorne shifted uncomfortably, realizing how his innocent comment had initially cast suspicion upon him, while Mrs. Ashworth's gloved hands gripped her handbag with increasing tension. But the most significant revelation came from research into historical records. Margaret continued, her voice carrying the weight of decades-old secrets finally brought to light. Eliza Finch did not die accidentally. She was murdered because she had discovered evidence that threatened to destroy two of Little Wickham's most prominent families. The silence in the hall was absolute, broken only by the soft whisper of morning wind against the windows. Margaret allowed the implications to settle before continuing with her inexorable analysis. 50 years ago, a young woman discovered financial irregularities involving the Charitable Relief Fund. Embezzlement that would have sent respected men to prison and destroyed their family's social standing. When Eliza Finch attempted to use this knowledge for her own advancement, she was silenced by someone who saw murder as preferable to scandal. The confession. Mrs. Ashworth's carefully maintained composure finally cracked entirely. Her shoulders sagged as if a tremendous weight had been acknowledged, and when she spoke, her voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting facts too painful for emotion. She was going to destroy everything, Mrs. Ashworth said quietly, her words falling into the hushed silence like stones into still water. Eliza Finch had discovered my father's involvement in the relief fund irregularities, and she thought she could use that knowledge to force Geoffrey Whitmore into marriage after their liaison resulted in consequences. Inspector Morrison leaned forward with professional attention as the confession continued, each word adding another piece to the puzzle that had tormented Little Wickham for half a century. I was 19, engaged to Arthur, with everything to lose if the truth came out. When Eliza arranged to meet Geoffrey at the mill house that night, I arrived first. We argued. She threatened to expose everything, and I— Her voice faltered for the first time. I struck her with the poker. She fell into the paraffin lamp, and the fire spread so quickly. The mechanical recitation continued as Mrs. Ashworth described staging the scene to appear accidental, watching from the shadows as young Arthur witnessed her departure, and spending the next 5 decades living with the knowledge that her secret was safe only as long as no one asked the right questions. The present danger. When Rosalind arrived and began researching property records, I recognized her immediately, Mrs. Ashworth admitted, her voice growing stronger with the relief of finally sharing her burden. She had her grandmother's eyes, her grandmother's determination. I tried to frighten her away with the cottage fire, but when that failed, I decided to eliminate her the same way I had eliminated the threat 50 years ago. The full horror of the recent events crystallized in the minds of the assembled villagers. The systematic destruction of evidence, The planted clues designed to implicate innocent people, the escalating threats, all had been orchestrated by someone they had trusted and respected for decades. Margaret gathered her knitting bag with quiet satisfaction as Inspector Morrison completed the formal procedures. The psychological battle had been won through patient observation and gentle persistence, proving once again that human nature revealed itself not in dramatic gestures, but in small, unconscious details. Aftermath and reflection. As Mrs. Ashworth was led away to face justice that had been delayed by half a century, the village began the difficult process of reconciling their long-held beliefs with the terrible reality of her crimes. Rosalind, her quest for truth finally completed, made quiet preparations to return to London, carrying with her the peace that comes from understanding the past, however painful that understanding might be. Margaret made her way home through streets that buzzed with shock and speculation, reflecting on the particular tragedy of secrets that festered rather than healed. Little Wickham would recover from this revelation, but it would do so with the knowledge that evil could flourish for decades beneath the most respectable surfaces. In her sitting room, surrounded by the comfortable rhythms of afternoon light and familiar objects, Margaret resumed her knitting with the quiet certainty that human nature, in all its complexity, would continue to provide both mysteries and revelations. The patterns of good and evil, love and hatred, truth and deception would weave themselves through village life as inevitably as the seasons themselves. The mystery of the woman who wrote a name on the fogged window had been solved, but its implications would linger in Little Wickham's collective memory like morning mist, gradually clearing, but leaving behind a landscape forever changed by what had been revealed in its lifting. The week following Mrs. Ashworth's confession brought Little Wickham the peculiar combination of relief and unease that follows the resolution of long-buried secrets. The autumn rain had washed the village clean, leaving behind air that seemed somehow lighter despite the weight of terrible knowledge now shared among its residents. Margaret observed this transformation from her sitting-room window, noting how neighbors who had avoided each other's eyes now met with the careful courtesy of people learning to rebuild trust from its foundations. The recovery of evidence. Inspector Morrison's methodical search of Ashworth House yielded the final pieces of a puzzle that had tormented Little Wickham for 50 years. From a locked compartment in Mrs. Ashworth's writing desk, they recovered a silver photograph frame, its glass bearing the telltale crescent smear of lemon polish that Margaret had detected at Rowan Cottage. The photograph itself was smoke-darkened at one corner, but clearly showed Eliza Finch at the village fete. Her backward glance captured forever alongside a young Vivian with a ribbon at her throat, her hand resting possessively on Eliza's sleeve, intimacy that had curdled into deadly rivalry. The recovered items told their own story of calculated deception. Dr. Whitmore's dress cufflinks, bearing the patina of years in storage, had been lifted during one of Mrs. Ashworth's charitable visits and planted to cast suspicion on the young doctor. The bootmaker's thread found at the library fire-matched samples from Mrs. Ashworth's mending basket, while her bicycle, when examined, revealed the distinctive wear pattern that had marked crime scenes throughout the village. Most poignant of all was the discovery in the parish records that Miss Bellwether had preserved, a childish notation in Arthur Ashworth's hand. "I saw a lady in a pale coat. The lamp went over." The sentence had waited 50 years for adult understanding, a child's honest observation dismissed as fantasy by adults too willing to accept convenient explanations. Personal reckonings. Martin Thorne's true relationship to the investigation emerged in quiet conversations that revealed the depth of Mrs. Ashworth's manipulation. He was not merely Rosalind's cousin pursuing family disputes, but a man who had loved her since childhood visits to their grandmother's village. His arrival in Little Wickham had been motivated not by inheritance quarrels, but by desperate concern for Rosalind's safety as she pursued her dangerous investigation. "I followed her here to protect her," he admitted to Margaret during a final visit before his departure. I was so focused on threats from London that I never suspected the real danger came from within the village itself. Mrs. Ashworth recognized me immediately and realized she could use my presence to deflect suspicion from herself. Dr. Whitmore, cleared of all suspicion, found himself the reluctant recipient of village sympathy that carried its own burden. His grandfather's stolen papers, recovered from Ashworth House, revealed the old constable's private conviction that murder had been committed, documented inconsistencies in the fire pattern, the locked mill house door, the position of Eliza's body. The evidence had been there all along, carefully ignored by a community that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The young doctor's relationship with Rosalind, revealed through their shared London past and mutual concern for historical justice, provided a foundation for healing that extended beyond individual trauma. Their careful conversations in the vicarage garden spoke of understanding forged through shared ordeal rather than mere romantic attachment. The village transforms. Little Wickham's reaction to the revelations followed patterns that Margaret had observed in previous crises. Initial shock giving way to determined normalcy, but with subtle alterations that marked permanent change. Mrs. Pemberton, once Mrs. Ashworth's most devoted follower, now bustled with the energy of someone cataloguing past slights as evidence of long-hidden malice. The comfortable certainties that had governed village social hierarchy required careful reconstruction around the knowledge that respectability could mask the deepest corruption. The Reverend Mr. Blackwood's Sunday sermon addressed forgiveness and the necessity of confronting uncomfortable truths, his words carrying new gravity born of recent events. The congregation sang with uneven conviction, their voices reflecting the community's struggle to reconcile cherished beliefs with harsh realities. Miss Bellwether supervised the rebinding of fire-damaged library records, treating each rescued page as evidence of the village's determination to preserve truth rather than convenient fiction. The gaps left by destroyed documents would serve as permanent reminders that some knowledge, once lost, could never be fully recovered. Margaret's reflections. As November settled over Little Wickham with its characteristic blend of mist and clarity, Margaret found herself reflecting on the particular tragedy of secrets that corrupted rather than protected. Mrs. Ashworth's original crime had begun as a desperate attempt to preserve respectability, but 50 years of concealment had transformed her into something far more dangerous than the frightened young woman who had struck Eliza Finch in panic. The psychological pressure of maintaining such deception had required constant vigilance, turning every newcomer into a potential threat and every question into possible exposure. The carefully orchestrated evidence, the systematic destruction of records, the escalating violence, all had been products of a mind that had learned to see murder as an acceptable solution to inconvenient problems. Most troubling was the realization that Mrs. Ashworth's position as social arbiter had provided perfect camouflage for her activities. Her reputation for moral rectitude, her meticulous attention to propriety, her role as guardian of village standards, all had served as shields that deflected suspicion while she planned increasingly desperate crimes. Peaceful resolution. Rosalind's departure came with the quiet dignity of someone whose quest had reached its natural conclusion. She sold Rowan Cottage to a young family from Market Chaltham, ensuring that its rooms would ring with children's laughter rather than echo with ancient sorrows. Her final conversation with Margaret carried the peace that comes from understanding the past, however painful that understanding might prove. Truth rarely comes wrapped in comfort, Margaret had observed, but it offers clarity, and with clarity, perhaps a path to peace. As the bus carried Rosalind back toward London and a future informed by but not imprisoned by the past, Little Wickham settled into its new understanding of itself. The village would heal as villages always did, but it would do so with hard-won wisdom about the fragility of appearances and the persistence of truth. Margaret resumed her knitting in the gathering dusk, counting stitches with the same careful attention she had paid to the subtle signs of human nature throughout the investigation. The patterns emerging beneath her needles reminded her that both good and evil required patience to reveal their true designs, and that the most important mysteries were often solved not through dramatic revelation, but through quiet observation of the small details that revealed the larger truths. Little Wickham had learned that respectability could mask corruption, that the most dangerous enemies often wore familiar faces, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, possessed its own inexorable patience. The mystery of the woman who wrote a name on the fogged window had been solved, but its implications would linger like morning mist, gradually clearing, but leaving behind a landscape forever changed by what had been revealed in its lifting. Christmas settled over Little Wickham with the gentle persistence of snow, transforming the village into something both familiar and renewed. The immediate shock of Mrs. Ashworth's confession had crystallized into a deeper understanding of the delicate balance between truth and community peace. Margaret observed this transformation from her sitting room, where frost patterns traced temporary messages on the windows before dissolving in the morning warmth. Ephemeral communications that left no permanent mark, unlike the secrets that had scarred the village for half a century. The season of resolution. Dr. Whitmore moved through his practice with restored confidence, his reputation strengthened rather than weakened by the ordeal. Patients brought not only their ailments, but also their quiet gratitude for his integrity under suspicion. He had begun cataloguing his grandfather's papers with meticulous care, ensuring that future investigations would benefit from preserved evidence rather than suffer from institutional neglect. Margaret noted how his interactions carried new warmth. The defensive reserve born of suspected guilt had dissolved, revealing the natural kindness that had always defined his character. The parish hall buzzed with preparations for the Christmas bazaar, its atmosphere lighter despite the weight of recent revelations. Mrs. Pemberton channeled her considerable energy into organizing a village historical society, ensuring that Little Wickham's stories, both comfortable and uncomfortable, would be preserved with honest accuracy. Miss Bellwether supervised the digitization of surviving records, treating each document as insurance against the selective memory that had allowed tragedy to fester in shadows. Letters from New Beginnings. Rosalind's correspondence arrived with the regularity of someone who had found peace through understanding. Her letters spoke of renewed purpose in London, of charity work that honored her grandmother's memory through constructive action rather than vengeful investigation. She had established a foundation supporting vulnerable women, transforming personal tragedy into public good. The enclosed photograph showed her at the foundation's opening ceremony, her expression carrying the serene strength of someone whose questions had finally found answers. Martin Thorne's engagement announcement brought additional closure to the tangled relationships that had drawn him to Little Wickham. His letter expressed gratitude for Margaret's role in clearing the path to happiness, mentioning plans to visit the village for their honeymoon, not to revisit sorrow, but to celebrate love's triumph over deception. Margaret folded the invitation with quiet satisfaction, pleased that truth had served as foundation for genuine happiness, justice, and mercy. Mrs. Ashworth's trial had concluded with a verdict that satisfied both legal requirements and community needs for closure. The proceedings revealed that Eliza Finch had been seeking help rather than threatening exposure. Letters discovered in Ashworth House showed a frightened young woman begging for assistance, not a calculating blackmailer demanding payment. The revelation cast Mrs. Ashworth's crime in even darker light, transforming justified self-defense into calculated murder of an innocent seeking aid. The judge's sentencing reflected both the gravity of her crimes and the tragedy of decades spent justifying the unjustifiable. Mrs. Ashworth would spend her remaining years in confinement, but her confession had provided the closure that families deserved and communities required for healing. Wisdom preserved. Inspector Morrison's final report praised the village's cooperation while noting the particular value of patient observation over dramatic confrontation. His parting words to Margaret, "Truth needs neither volume nor haste, only persistence," captured the essence of her investigative philosophy. The physical evidence had mattered, but the psychological insights had proved decisive in unraveling 50 years of carefully maintained deception. As Christmas Eve approached, Margaret found herself drawn to the churchyard, where a new headstone marked Eliza Finch's grave. The replacement marker, funded by Rosalind's quiet generosity, bore an honest inscription: "Eliza Finch, beloved daughter and mother, taken too soon. Truth endures." The simple words carried more dignity than decades of euphemistic concealment. Final reflections. In her sitting room, surrounded by the comfortable rhythms of firelight and familiar objects, Margaret resumed her knitting with the satisfaction of work completed. The patterns emerging beneath her needles reminded her that both truth and beauty required patience to achieve their full design, and that the most important victories were often won through quiet persistence rather than dramatic revelation. The mystery of the woman who wrote a name on the fogged window had been solved, its implications absorbed into the village's collective wisdom. Little Wickham had learned that respectability could mask corruption, that dangerous enemies often wore familiar faces, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, possessed its own inexorable patience. Outside, snow continued falling over streets that hummed with genuine contentment. The village had survived the revelation of its darkest secret and emerged stronger, understanding that transparency, however uncomfortable, provided more reliable foundations than the most carefully maintained deceptions. Christmas bells would soon ring over a community finally at peace with its past, ready to embrace a future built on honesty rather than concealment. Margaret counted her stitches with the same careful attention she had paid to human behavior throughout the investigation, understanding that both required patience, observation, and faith that truth would eventually find its way to light.